So I have a question. Could this potentially be the almost last hurrah of a dying superpower? Someone who's trying to go at a last-ditch effort to regain some of that power that they've lost over the last 30 years? Because as you mentioned, Russia's not an economic power. All they really have is their military. Do you think they're trying to regain some of that lost territory into and build up a little more power, or at least try to?
That's a great question. So I think if I have it right, I was hearing this morning they're G11, but maybe the 11th largest economy. So they still, I mean, they still have a basis for power, right?
Yeah.
In terms of land, in terms of an economic position, even if it's not as dominant as it once was. I think it is going to depend a lot on the reaction of other states. So far, it looks like the reaction of Ukrainians is really more robust than maybe first expected, and the reaction of people like European Union Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen shutting off airspace. It'll just be interesting to see how it plays out, but that somehow I don't see it as a death knell. That would be my guess.
John?
It's a great question. And I don't think any of us have a great answer for it. I don't think we know. I would say that the reaction that we've seen, I think it surprised all of us probably, the reaction and the unity of the reaction. It does not bode well for Putin and for Russia into the future. I mean, clearly Russia's not going away. The question is, what will its form be in 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Will it be in kind of a corrupt oligarchic regime? Will it be something approaching a democracy? Will it be a democracy? I think that a lot of that depends on the reaction of the Russian people as well. Of course, you're dealing with, an authoritarian state in which people are thrown in jail and killed for opposing the regime. So it's not like we have a good sense of what Russians are thinking themselves right now. We certainly know what Eastern Europeans think. And I'll just make an editorial comment here. Sometimes NATO is perceived or is portrayed as somehow being on some kind of morally equivalent plane with the Warsaw Pact. But you have to remember that the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's military alliance, was imposed, as Richard said, by the military occupation of those countries and by force. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, whether it was a wise thing to do or not from a strategic point of view, was done at the invitation of all of those countries who wanted to join NATO. So from a Eastern European point of view, outside of Russia, clearly NATO is a very popular thing, and it got a lot more popular in the last week because it's seen as an alliance of democratic countries that are engaged in an effort of mutual defense. So I guess getting back to your original question, I think it remains to be seen. Clearly, the efforts by the West to put sanctions on the Russian regime and to really cause economic turmoil is, even if it's not stated publicly, is intended to undermine the legitimacy of that regime and to bring about, mass dissatisfaction with the regime. So perhaps someday there would be regime change. But he's not going to go quickly or easily.
But eventually he will go. But Russia will stay. That's the thrust of when we're talking about 400 years of history. Russia has never had anything but an authoritarian ruler. Some of them have been extraordinarily violent. I wouldn't want to be quoted saying, if you scratch a Russian, you scratch an authoritarian, but the country does not have a history of democracy. There were hopes in the 90s with Yeltsin, but hopes, but nothing really to base that upon. So I do not envision this to be the last gasp of Russia at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I might not finish my sentence. I'm Ukrainian. Okay. So I'm emotionally involved in all of this. So how far is the rest of the world willing to go to stop Putin? I mean, I don't think he's going to stop. The guy's a little bit Hitlerish. Okay. He's going to take Ukraine, then he's going to start taking the rest of them back. I mean, when you showed that map, USSR went all the way up to Germany. There's all the Czech Republic. There's, so many countries there are there that he's not going to stop. The guy's hungry and power hungry, and he wants to show the world that, you can't stop me. So how how is NATO and the rest of the world what are they willing to do to stop him? Is my question.
All right, I'll go first. That's a very powerful and emotional question, to be sure. I do not envision the West using direct military power to push Russia out of Ukraine, as the West did in Kuwait in 1991 to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I think there are a number of factors that explain that. In the immediate, the West doesn't have those resources. The West may collectively be much more powerful than Russia, but NATO is not the power it was in 1991 when we had 330,000 troops permanently deployed in Europe on the front line on the Fulda Gap. So the West at present does not have military resources in the theater to confront this kind of invasion. So I think, however, what I've seen in the last week is that the initial bite of sanctions is one having a psychological impact, because you're seeing that in Moscow and throughout Russia. But it's becoming increasingly clear that this is going to make the Russian economy scream. Putin might not give a rat's ass about that, but we will see what transpires with the Russian people, because the Russian people have become accustomed to a certain standard of living, but that standard of living is predicated on the import of manufactured goods. Again, you don't have anything on your person right now from Russia. They don't produce things, and that's going to be cut off. They are becoming a pariah. And importantly, I would say, and this I think we should have done I think my perspective, the biggest foreign policy blunder of the Obama years was not effectively responding to Crimea. And I believe this has changed that. I believe you will see permanent, what Putin his goal was to get the West out of Eastern Europe. And this, as John said, this is having just the opposite response. The Germans have finally decided to cut the check. And you're going to see substantial forces put in all of the frontline states. And again, to go back to Putin being somewhat rational, the idea of making an intrusion into Lithuania or Estonia, if there are frontline NATO troops there and you will be killing Americans on the first day, that changes the calculation. I would like to say that I think Putin has been astoundingly reckless in talking about nuclear weapons during this conflict. No Soviet leader would have done that. And this then does lead us to questioning because people are questioning his, not only the rationality, but his judgment at this point. And I've heard pretty senior people, General Clapper, refer to him as insane. I don't go that far. I'm not willing to go that far. I think he's ruthless in what he's trying to do, but recklessly talking about the use of nuclear weapons, and conversely, how President Biden has so soberly put that down.
Maybe briefly, I would just say, though I don't know if it offers much succor to somebody who has Ukrainian roots, like the fact of economic sanctions, the freezing of assets from the Russian central bank, right? Kind of blockading Russia economically might be more effective in the short and long run than we think. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how cyber attack and stuff plays out here, because I just expect that pretty much any moment. Like, how is that type of conflict going to play out on both sides? Because that can be, I think, more devastating than we expect, than we anticipate. And even though there's 175,000 at least Russian troops in Belarus and marching through 40-mile right convoy making its way to Kiev, maybe these more indirect economic levers can be of some kind of assistance in fighting Putin.
Do we have anyone from the chat?
We had a great question from the chat. A question from Professor Jen Liu. Would having two official languages, both Ukrainian and Russian, help to foster inclusion? Successful democratic countries such as Canada and Switzerland have multiple official languages.
That's for you.
Oh, that's for me. I should have said, no, there are no questions. No, okay, so I think that's it is an excellent question. So I think this is being played out in the Baltic countries as well, right? Right, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they've been, making their sort of their indigenous non-Russian language the official language and not recognizing Russian, and in some cases forcing Russians in the near abroad to learn that new language as a precondition for citizenship and for voting in national elections. Certainly there were moves in Ukraine to make Russian official at the local level. There was a case that proceeded up to the Supreme Court in Ukraine about to try to establish Russian as an official language. I think with the influence of Russian media throughout Ukraine, it's just a very slippery slope to create the Russian language as official in Ukraine, but maybe there's some other middle ground.
Well, I would say during the Soviet period, the Moscow required basically elites to speak Russian. So it was part of their control and destruction of Ukraine, that if you wanted to be a leader in Ukraine, you could not attend university. You really needed to speak Russian. And that's a bit about what this war is about. This idea of Russian hegemony. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were 25 million Russian nationals living in the various republics. About 12 to 15 million were in Ukraine. So that is also a major component of this conflict, because you still have a great many Russian nationals in Ukraine. The language question is a fascinating one, because it was also in the Baltics, is that the Soviets requiring Russian to be spoken in the Baltics. And that was one of their very first pushbacks in 91, 92, which is tell the Russians, you need to learn Latvian. And that was really tough for the Russians. They saw that as a huge humiliation. But you had a lot of Russian, especially ex-Russian military, because the Baltics were the more pleasant place to live in the Soviet Empire. And so, yeah, the Latvians, the Lithuanians played hardball. They say, no, if you want to be a part of Latvia, you need to speak Latvian.
So I've really appreciated this forum, and I kind of want to take a slightly different angle of thinking about not just what's happening there, but how that impacts some of the stuff and the reactions we're having here. So, CPAC, you have two very different approaches that are coming out in conservative conversations. So you have Tucker Carlson supporting Russia, supporting Putin. You have other, leaders in the Republican Party still speaking out against. I think we have our own experience over the last 4 years of what can happen with authoritarian kind of strength ideas. And so how is this playing out going to continue to impact kind of how we see our own democracy that has been in the slide for the last 4 years?
We're not taking any political questions.
Oh, you're looking at me, Richard?
I am. I'm thinking of my answer, so you go ahead.
I'll just give you my off the cuff response, and that would be that take a look at old pictures from 1991 of the George Bush administration, and look at the adults that were in the room there. Whether you agreed with his administration or not, whether you're politically on one side or the other, if you looked at the people that were involved at that time, people like Scowcroft and Colin Powell and George Shultz, and if you think of all of those people from the Republican mainstream, again, whether you agree with or disagree with their politics, they took the standard American view of how to deal with the Soviet Union, how to deal with Russia, the one that had developed over the last 45 years. This is just my editorial comment, my personal view. That's the kind of approach we need from the Republican Party today, because that's the one that essentially won the Cold War. I mean, that's the one that essentially kept Russia, the Soviet Union, where it was. That's why we had 45 years of a cold peace, but a peace nonetheless. And so, yeah, talking about somehow trying to rationalize or justify Russian actions in this case, it's totally outside the mainstream of all of American foreign policy, Democratic or Republican. It is happening.
We could say they shouldn't, but.
Here's where I think rationality, we get back to rationality again. And it's one thing to say it on TV, but when you're actually having to make decisions about what American foreign policy should be, I think, again, those kind of laws of gravity come back into play. And the idea, and it's just, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm naive, but it's just unthinkable to me that the United States could take any other position but to oppose what's going on and to strengthen NATO as a result. Because the whole key to American and Western security in Europe is based on the strength of NATO, and it's based on the collective security agreement between them. And the credibility of that agreement has to be maintained no matter what. And that's why, going back to Tanya's question, you're not going to see NATO involving itself in Ukraine, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, because they're not a member of NATO. And the United States doesn't want to get into a shooting war with the Russians, unfortunately for Ukraine. Will Putin move into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland? No, I don't think so, because those are all members of NATO. And the key to NATO is the credibility of the commitment that each country will defend each other. If you lose that credibility, if Estonia somehow gets sucked back into the Russian orbit without any opposition, then all of a sudden the credibility of NATO just goes right down the drain. So I don't think those countries are at risk. And that's exactly why those non-member countries want to join NATO, is because of that commitment. So I don't have a good answer to your question either.
Maybe just to add to John, to agree and underline, right, that transatlantic relationship between the U.S. and like-minded, countries with similar values, similar systems. I wouldn't see why we wouldn't side with people who share those values and share those behaviors versus support somebody like Putin, right, who's associated with murder of journalists, poisoning of rivals, assassinations. That's not the company I like to keep.
Right.
I don't think that's the company that anybody in here likes to keep. So,
Well, maybe Tucker Carlson, because I do watch Fox News periodically, and to watch his commentary on a nightly basis continues to speak of the implosion of a certain wing, although that wing is pretty large, of the Republican Party. And we have a gentleman in the room, Tim Sanders, who worked for one of the Republicans that John spoke of, Senator Lugar from this state, for many years. And Senator Lugar, supported by old line Republicans like Tim and Tanya Sanders, that was the base of the party. And I continue to be extraordinarily concerned that when you have a liberal a democracy and you only have two political parties, they both must be committed to liberal democracy. And we have a very serious problem at this point. And the thought that we continue to look for moments of, again, the adults in the room. After January 6th, we were looking for the adults in the room in the months after. And now we're still looking for adults in the room. It makes for a very, very difficult, and this certainly is something that Putin is very much aware of and has fueled. He has very much fueled and cultivated a relationship here.
I would just add to that to say that, it's something we always talk about in our classes, is that historically American foreign policy, at least during the Cold War years, was essentially nonpartisan. There was not a great deal of difference between the two parties when it came to foreign policy. Huge differences on domestic policy, but in terms of in terms of support for NATO, in terms of support for our Western allies, in terms of commitment to liberal democracy, I mean, you can see that whether you're talking about, I don't know, Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, or Reagan and the evil empire. I mean, it's different language, it's different approach perhaps, but it's the same fundamental policy of supporting our Western allies and now our Eastern European allies. So yes, the emergence of division on that point is troublesome.
Take one or two more questions. Yes.
Yeah, so say if Russia were to secede though in the invasion of Ukraine, like what would that look like? You guys brought up how they would be interested to place a satellite like puppet regime in charge, but would they like take any of like the separatist land? Are they only invading through like into the separatist territories and willing to take that, or are they trying to go in and take all of it, you think?
It's reasonably clear. we were looking for the different routes of the potential invasion, and it turned out to be our worst scenario. The worst scenario has unfolded. It's a comprehensive land and air invasion and naval operations on the Black Sea. So the indication is it's an effort in the moment to decapitate the government. President Zelensky is on a kill list. And after the decapitation of the government, then the control of the system comprehensively, and then establishing some level of political control from Moscow. And that is a real possibility here. Again, because it does not seem that the West would use military force to prevent that. Again, you can make the economy scream, but if your adversary is willing to accept that cost, it will happen. You know, one of the areas for, I'm going to say hope, but for opposition to Putin is domestically. That will prove to be more and more interesting as the weeks go by. But yeah, this is the first time I say Soviets. It's not a bad phrase. The Russian has these. John mentioned Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68. You were a little young for that, but both of those were examples of the East Europeans' opposition to the communist rule that had been imposed in the mid '40s and later '40s, and they were crushed ruthlessly. Moscow sent in 5,000 tanks to Hungary in '56, and the puppet regime was reestablished. It remains to be seen what this situation will look like. I'm not too with a good friend in my room, in the room who's Ukrainian. It's not my pleasure to say that I don't want to say Ukraine is lost, but it is going to be very difficult to reverse this.
Okay, thank you.
Any final questions, chat?
There was a question in the chat from Professor Duzinkiewicz asking, what are the essential differences between Ukrainians and Russians? I was trying to think about that myself.
I wish he was. I'm sorry, we can't let him speak because he's a specialist in the field, and he would like to hear from us. I would not. Well,
I guess leaders have been, President Poroshenko of Ukraine would try to say, hey, we have some religious common threads, but we're trying to say there's a separate Ukrainian Orthodox Church and a separate Russian Orthodox Church, right? That those are somehow distinct. Orientation toward a pluralist liberal democracy within Ukraine, and that not being a heavy priority within the Russian Federation, and East versus West orientation. Those are differences that come to mind for me.
I don't have a good answer to that question either. I would just say that, I think it's important to think about this is essentially an identity question. And identity may have some kind of tangible real world roots, but a lot of it is socially constructed. It's a lot of identity is what we conceive identity to be. So, what do Ukrainians think they are? What do Russians think they are? Do they think of themselves as the same or different, or to what degree are they different? It is largely a social question. I would just say, and Professor Duzinkiewicz is the person to answer this. It's too bad he's not on the mic so we could hear him. But Ukraine is really one of those areas of Eastern Europe that has almost too much. They're the wrong geography in the sense that it has been historically a place of great diversity. I mean, the issue of religion has been mentioned. Religion has been an extremely divisive issue in Ukraine for centuries. You had Orthodox Christians, you had Byzantine Catholic Christians, you had Roman Rite Christians, and now you have a split within the Orthodox Church between those that have that are loyal to a Kiev Patriarch and those that are loyal to a Moscow Patriarch. So even in the case of religion, you've got an incredible amount of diversity in this relatively small geographic area. And of course, you could add to that the linguistic diversity we've seen on the screen. Ukraine, unfortunately, finds itself in one of those, I don't know what the word is exactly, but one of those territories in kind of East Central Europe that has traditionally been at the forefront of the pull of the great powers. And religion is a great example of how the country has in some parts leaned west and in other parts leaned east. You can see that in, like, as I said, the difference between the different religious groups there.
Sure. I wouldn't quite put it that way. The territory of Ukraine, one has been contested between the Lithuanian Empire, the Polish Empire, and the Russian Empire, as you know. And the greater Ukrainian region came under the, they would say, the yoke of Moscow in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Catherine the Great. I wouldn't differentiate communist and the imperial period. But I wanted to, our question on Ukrainian identity is fascinating. And I would say one thing, maybe we'll close on this note, that Meg did a splendid job of talking about political contestation and plurality and pluralism in Ukraine. And there are clearly authoritarians in Ukraine, but there are clearly Democrats. I think many more Democrats in Ukraine, and their voice has been articulated. I believe there are also to be Democrats in Russia, but Putin has been so effective in crushing not only dissent, but free speech. Russian media controls everything. And so we're not hearing from the Russian people as we heard from the Ukrainian people. And I do think that's a distinction. And again, if you're looking for some of the Achilles heel of Russia, it's not in a nuclear confrontation, it's in weakening that component of Russian identity. So I want to thank everyone, particularly my colleagues, Meg Rinker and John Schwartz, for being with me today. I have to say, we'll revisit this topic with you as the times go forward. Thank you all very, very much.